Welcome to Cracking Conflict, a 15-episode series on the Fearlessly Human podcast. I'm Kavita Khanna, a leadership and culture strategist, coming to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And I'm Dr. Vicki Dalton, a clinical and forensic psychologist tuning in from Indianapolis in the US of A.
Welcome back, everyone. We are now on episode 13. The last episode was a biggie, and we really went deep into cognitive distortions and understanding what happens with the brain psychology. So those are our internal patterns. This episode is also a biggie, so fair warning. And now we're going to look at the external patterns and what happens in terms of taking in information, both to express conflict, but also to understand and manage it. So today's episode is about culture clash and communication. But enough from me, Vicki.
All right. So I thought I would kind of lean into talking about maybe some of our upbringing, the culture that we grow up in, is a good place to start, because that is where we first learn to think, feel, interact, understand, interpret the world. We learn in our family of origin, obviously within the communities that we live in, within the culture and the countries that we live in. But at a pretty small macro kind of level, actually smaller one, is the idea of your family. And I think if I pose the question, most people could kind of think about this and have an answer. Some families have a culture where differences in opinions are encouraged, are asked to be shared. And in those families, wasn't mine, by the way, in those families, they learn how to disagree respectfully and share back and forth. They learn how to have those dialogues. But many of us grew up in homes where we didn't know how to handle the conflict, or it wasn't acceptable. In my home, we could make all the jokes that we wanted. But anger was a pretty uncomfortable thing. And so when it would erupt, there was an awful lot of kind of paralysis that would happen, or efforts to distract and shut down. And understanding your origins, your family. I can remember once visiting a friend of mine who was Italian. And they had a big family, and they'd have these big meals. And the first time I had been over to his house, it was chaos erupting all around, and I was so uncomfortable because they were fighting and yelling at each other and disagreeing over like a meal. And at the end of it, they're like, "Hey, this was great coming over. Thanks, Vicki. We loved having you. You added a lot to the dynamic." And then everybody was giving hugs and leaving, and I'm like, "You just had a fight, like an hour-long fight." and he's like, "What are you talking about?" And I'm like, "Your family." He's like, "Who was fighting?" I was like, "Everybody." Like, did you not? And that was like my first light bulb moment that families do it differently. They were Italian, so maybe that was part of it, but I don't think it was all of it. And it is a common tendency. What we feel comfortable with starts within our family.
Absolutely. I think upbringing is really important. It creates those boundaries that we internalize, and very early learnings about what those boundaries are. And I'm sure it happens globally. You're told what words are acceptable, how to behave acceptably. And it doesn't stop at the family, but that's where you learn it first. Your parents, your siblings, they teach you about those boundaries. And those boundaries are kind of like a reference frame for you. And then you can slightly unlearn them when you go to school, and then as you become more independent in your thinking, you unlearn them a little bit more, but not a lot more. And that's kind of, if you think about it as the boundaries within which you are running around and dealing with conflict, within which your emotions are being processed, that's where culture comes to play a big part. Culture is nothing more than context. So the boundaries define your context. That context or the lens helps you to interpret information. And In terms of conflict, like I said before, your brains are primed in a certain way, and that's quite basic. So it comes from your upbringing, whether you like it or not, whether you're an independent thinker or not. You've been hardwired to think in a certain way in terms of your response to that conflict, but also in terms of how you're interpreting information. That's your default state. And then because of learned experiences, because you know some skills, because you've practiced some other skills, you kind of step past it to receive information. So now imagine somebody in a conflict situation with their toolkit of whatever they've come up with. I'm not going to call it baggage, but I'm going to call it toolkit. They then walk into the situation. They're starting to filter information and process it in a certain way. And unless they understand the boundaries, they understand the broader context, it's just going to stay in that default pattern of behavior.
I really like how you worded a lot of that, especially the fact that, culture is really just context. And I think about folks that go from one company and the culture within that company to another and recognize that the context is different and therefore expectations are different. And it takes them time to figure that out. How does this show up in global teams or maybe in cross-functional partnerships? Do you see
Yeah.
this?
So let's take a simpler example to start with, and then I'll go to the global team. So let's just think about somebody who is coming to work for the first time. So, a new entrant. They have been in the context of university or learning, and they've been processing information in a certain way. They walk into a workplace, the rules and the settings are different, and all of a sudden you are having to navigate that. And you're having to learn what's acceptable and not acceptable. You may have the best induction program in the world as a company, but these unwritten rules are something that are absorbed. And there's a model that talks about how people process this through anecdotes, through understanding who's got the real power, what are some of the rituals that we follow. So it's called the web model of culture. But what that essentially is trying to do, that model and many other models are trying to explain and decode what are the different elements in a culture context. And culture, you can take the organization as a micro version of it and then throw in a global angle to it, and that makes it macro. One thing, though, I do want to say here, it's this disclaimer across this entire conversation. The way we talk about ethnicities or nationalities, they're all modern concepts. They've come in because it's convenient to club together a few traits and say that's common across this population. So what we are going to step into is generalization. And why that's important is because it's again a shortcut. So we don't want to kind of have to think through all of the nuances. We kind of want a shortcut so we can get to interpret something and then go to the next step. So whatever I'm going to describe now is majorly shortcuts about whether I'm talking about regional cultures or whether it is national cultures. It's all shortcuts. So let's start with culture itself, right? So Edgar Schein, his famous iceberg model talks about what you see on the surface, which is, artifacts, which is in an organization setting, it's all the visible structures, the rules, the processes. You understand those and you decipher those and you navigate through that. And then beneath the surface, there is the acceptable layer. There is the assumptions that inform the acceptability, which is not visible. right?
Uh-huh.
That
Mm-hmm.
that makes it ripe for us to either misinterpret things, which leads to conflict, or it makes it ripe for us to, when we are in a conflict situation, to then have to work our way through getting information, processing it, and really responding to it in a way that helps us to manage it.
I really like where you're going with this, particularly talking about, yes, the generalization and the shortcuts, right? That's
Yeah,
important for all of us to understand. And we have to have something.
yeah.
And sometimes it's wrong, but the making sure that we look at the totality, of the situation. And we are at risk for misinterpreting at times as a result of that.
So I'll walk you through a model. It's not mine. I'll walk you through a model of what happens in conflict. It's a made-up model. But essentially what's happening initially is there's a situation that's got incompatibility. That's what conflict is all about. It's about two parties or several parties having incompatibility. That's stage one. So there is a situation that exists. Stage two is all the people involved are understanding that set of information, that potential for why things are not in my worldview. And that cognition is really coming from a place of personalization. So this is where all your cultural boundaries and your reference points come in. So you are already, and I'll go back to your cognitive distortion piece, you're already kind of you're operating with a filter that's informed by all your experiences, all your early childhood education, as it were, and that's the starting point where you're recognizing this doesn't work for me. That then sets your intentions of what you do with it, right? So we haven't stepped a lot into this, but you've heard of avoidance behaviors. You've heard about people feeling more comfortable with it and leaning into it. So it's those intentions. They are also informed by who you are, what are the things that you've brought along with you. And so this stage 2 and stage 3, which is about cognition and this intention phase, this is where culture plays a huge role. And then the next step would be behaviors. And this is where I take you back to some of our older episodes where we started talking about, ground rules, acceptable behaviors, setting some of those standards within this present conflict so that we can walk through it. So that's the behaviors part of it. And then there is, as a result of this, you have outcomes. So either we have resolved the conflict, we have increased our trust as a group, and we can work through things, or we have not resolved the conflict, or it's gone underground. So think about these 5 stages, and particularly the stage 2 and 3. So the stage where you are receiving information and personalizing it and interpreting it, and then deciding the intention of it, which is what are you going to do about it. Those 2 are the stages that really, when we talk about global culture, those are the 2 stages where it really plays an important part. That was one big chunk of information.
It was, but I think I was tracking. Hopefully folks out there were with us. And I think about particularly part about the emotional expression in that culture, what's appropriate or expected. And I can recall talking with some friends of mine who have worked with companies that were more, like, say, Asian or Asian Pacific. They have they had to learn that their expression when they were in conflict or are not happy wasn't going to be particularly obvious the way that it might be in their culture. And so they had to manage their expectations.
Do you remember your example of the joke that you told that kind of fell flat?
Oh yeah. About the attorney. Yeah, I'm like, oh, everybody over here hate attorneys. What do they? How do they feel about them? They pick on them over there. That was, I think, in China, I think, right? And
Yeah,
and
yeah,
nobody answered. It was like crickets. And yes, that was where I learned. They're not going to talk negative about somebody who's on, even if it was. I was setting the stage that the expectation it was okay to use it humor
yeah.
wise. It was not their culture, and it took me a little bit to catch up. And and I've had conversations where I didn't know the other person was upset because I was looking for cues that I understood
Yeah.
relative to my experiences and context, and found out later that we were disagreeing, and I didn't even really understand how much we were disagreeing because I was expecting a certain set of cues and behaviors. I think you talked about maybe stage 4. So that's helpful to put it in some of those contexts.
I'll also touch upon, and I promise you this is the last bit of theory. I'll touch upon a couple of people who have done some amazing work in the space of organization and national cultures. So the first is, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, it's Geert Hofstede. And some of you may have heard about it, but Hofstede's cultural dimensions, there are 6 dimensions that he had this huge study exploring across all nations, and it's even now, that was done, I don't know, decades ago, and it's even now used as a reference point in terms of navigating different cultures. So that one breaks it down in terms of how different nations, and again, the disclaimer that because national boundaries are not that rigid from a culture perspective, so just take it with a pinch of salt, it is a model. And the first one to think about is the power distance. So how much do you understand hierarchy and how much hierarchy is acceptable? That is, in a low power distance culture, just because you're a boss doesn't mean you can boss over me. High power distance, there is huge respect for hierarchy. So if you have a role, it comes preloaded with everything you need in terms of authority, in terms of what you can say, not say, in terms of how much power you yield. So that's one dimension. There's another interesting dimension, which is about low uncertainty and high uncertainty. So it's called uncertainty avoidance. So there are cultures where you want precision, you want to be sure. And then there are cultures where things can move and it's fine. And so take the example, and this is sorry, but you take the example of somebody who arrives on time, say from a Germanic culture, who's expecting what is being said is what's being meant, and they expect outcomes and results. So that's the set of things they come with because they don't have tolerance for uncertainty. And then you take a Asiatic culture, which is fatalistic, which is like, yeah, things will break down, yeah, it's fine. And they're operating from a good enough kind of a perspective. You put 2 people from these cultures together, and you're just begging for conflict to happen because one person saying this precisely, the other person is interpreting it as maybe just meant it. And there is no other one, and here's a nod to my Indian heritage. There's nothing more stark about this than the Indian nod, you know. I don't know if you've heard about this. Have
The
you
Indian
seen?
nod.
Yeah.
That doesn't
So
mean, what does that mean? Is that a yes? Is that a no? What is that?
exactly.
Yeah. The non-committal nod? Are you telling me that's like an intentional thing? Are you taught that in your
Oh,
culture?
so this is the other perspective. Rich contextual culture versus low context cultures. And this takes me to the next model, sorry, which is
We are
Fons
doing a deep dive.
Fons Trompenaar's model.
Yes,
And
I know where you're going.
yeah, he goes a little bit deeper into explaining what happened. What he is talking about goes more into processing information. So where Hofstede's model talks about individuals' responses. This is talking more generically about how the group behaves.
Okay.
So it's kind of, it talks about things such as individualism versus communitarianism, not communists. So please don't get your hackles up. Is it more important to be able to act as an individual, to be able to contribute in a group, or is it more important to stay loyal to the group? And the boundaries can be, you take the example of working in Japan, the team's more important, the organization is more important, versus US, and strangely even India. It is about the individual being the individual and wanting to contribute. So there's no suppression of the individual story, but there is definitely, in the other culture, you suppress what you come along with, and you kind of work with everyone else. There are some other dimensions which are useful in a conflict kind of a thing, particularly. Is it better to show emotions, or is it better to keep emotions? So when you were talking about your family, I was thinking about that. Or even this one is really pertinent in an organization. It's about the time dimension. Are people looking at sequential time versus synchronous time? Is time a finite resource to be closely managed? Or is it something that can be used flexibly? In fact, in some cultures, it is considered that you're living time, and you create time by living. It's very difficult to understand this in a simple way if you're coming from the other culture. So the manifestations of that is you will see people talking about agendas and things like that in a meeting situation, whereas people again, are talking about agendas and everything, but they're not really meaning what it means for somebody who's coming from a sequential kind of a time dimension. So that's enough.
That's a lot.
So
that's a lot.
That's a lot. Yeah, that's a lot.
And some of the stuff that I heard in this that I think is just some beautiful little nuggets that I'm going to pull out of it in terms of some of my business clients, some of my personal clients, my own darn life, recognizing that in almost all of these theories and these things that you were discussing are talking about perspective, the perspective that you're coming from, and expectations. Correct. Managing the expectations and knowing the expectations, and perhaps finding ways to get people to communicate about those. So when I think about some clients that I work with that are, they have home offices in multiple countries. They have teams that almost kind of run 24 hours around the clock because somebody's in a different time zone. Like, you're living my tomorrow, coffee time. Like, my mind is blown every time I think about this. You're living in tomorrow for me in New Zealand from the US, right? So those, just the time zones, let alone with that managing expectations and cultures and the ability to communicate kind of about it. So to me, it comes back to some of our earlier conversations about we need to be deliberate about these discussions, creating a culture, to use today's term, of an environment where we can bring this up if it is a potential cultural difference or understanding. Do you see examples of that?
Yeah, totally. And what this calls really is for whoever is in the situation to be hyper alert. The rules are still the same, or the process is still the same. You walk into a conflict situation, what's being asked of you as a human is being extra aware of what you are, what you're bringing with you, and then listen carefully to the information while being aware that you're going to process it in a certain way. So that consciousness is what we need. And that, I can say, is a standard set of whatever is your coping mechanism to get you to that state. Or from a brain perspective, you are moving away from your amygdala patterns to a prefrontal executive function, exercising your executive function space. And that's the fluency that we really want to learn in conflict. So organizations that can help people move to that place of fluency, that's where setting rules, having roles such as conscious roles that are focused on setting some kind of way to navigate conflict, but also acknowledging the differences between people. I think that's universal. So I don't think that part it needs to be broken down much, but
But think about the skill set. Having the skill set that you're describing, improving and getting better at it, what you would bring to the table at a company, in a relationship. I feel like I am often interpreting the language of the adolescents that I work with to their parents, or usually more often the other way because I'm like old, like their parent now. So it's usually me interpreting to the child what the parent is trying to say in a language they understand, but without the emotional piece that they are putting a context in. And so I think about the value these folks would have out there as we're listening to this at really better understanding some of these theories. I don't know that I can probably geek out as well on this. I loved watching you do. You get deep, and I could tell you're just like, I'll just say some high level stuff. I'm like, wow, that's your high level stuff, Kavita. You got it. But the value in learning this kind of stuff, how much does this upscale your skills and marketability in a workplace, particularly in a place that's, culturally potentially diverse, or a company that's more global, and wanting to move up in management, and in responsibilities? This skill seems pretty valuable to me.
I think so. But I also want to put a question in terms of how do we design systems that honor these differences? I know DEI is these days kind of not fashionable, but what we are talking about is diverse perspectives coming together. So how do we design systems in general that honor the differences and still allow for shared resolution where all parties feel like they have got something? It's not a compromise. Everyone's come into it with eyes wide open. And at the same time, when everyone goes away, they've got better understanding of each other and each other's perspectives, and have moved a step closer to working together better. And so that's my question to you from a
that's me. That's to me.
From a
I thought it was a hypothetical. You want me to answer that? Okay, keep going. I'll give it a shot. I'll give it a shot. Is it
okay? So I think we can really look to the psychology profession to see how we can break this down in a way that might be useful for our listeners. So what is it? What's your process when you bring in conflicting parties?
Yep. I feel like I can go there pretty confidently. The concept of that I lay the foundation, for is different doesn't mean right or wrong. It just means different. And that's an important piece. Your perspective of what you think is the right way to do something. Everybody always thinks their way, my way is the right way. It's got part of that cognitive distortion. My stuff is stuff, your stuff is crap. That kind of concept is at risk, right? But ultimately, when people come to the table, I want them to have diverse ideas, especially for problem solving. If we're trying to create something in the business or the scientific community and world, we need difference of ideas. If we all had the same, there wouldn't be new creativity. We would be at a loss when stuck with a problem. So we want that kind of diversity of ideas, and culture probably brings pieces of that by nature. So I start off when I'm working with folks that are kind of coming in a conflict that we're doing this today because we're thinking we're not really aligned. And we'll probably get more into this on the next episode. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I feel like it's important that we set the stage for, conflict is okay. And let's understand where that conflict is coming from. And I encourage people to try to use those listening skills, being able to keep their amygdala hijack at bay, use that executive functioning piece, right? And what's the problem to be listening for. What is the problem I'm trying to solve? And this is where I think the culture piece wraps into that, because sometimes I'm able to help them have these aha moments of, oh, we're not really disagreeing. We're just looking at it differently. And so that's an important piece. Sometimes it is flat out disagreement. Sometimes it's about the family history, or the cultural perception of it, but getting people to effectively communicate about their perspective and their expectations, to kind of quote like 80% of the theory stuff you're referring to, and then seeing where can we find alignment. And in that space, it involves creativity. And we do need to manage the conflict, because conflict crushes creativity.
I think that's extremely valuable, because if we take that into the design of systems, what we're really talking about is you need a system where the minute, or there's some way of recognizing that you've got diverse perspective on a topic. The first thing is to kind of have conflict is okay frame. And then the second thing that organizations need to desperately do when they are dealing with teams that will be naturally going into a situation of conflict is to create that space to listen and to interpret. And you don't need it all of the time, but you need it periodically. And I think the third element is having somebody objective periodically inject their observations, because it's very valuable for people to have somebody who is non-partisan, who's just saying what they're seeing, so that they can take that pause and interpret it.
You just like summarize like 80% of my job, right? I'm
much.
that third party neutral, right? That proposes other ideas or encourages a different perspective.
Correct.
So
And I think that those are the interventions you can consciously design, because most organizations are not wading through conflict all the time.
Right.
It is at critical moments that you almost can see those patterns. One is budget time, when resources are being allocated. The other one is when you have to justify your performance. That's another classic one. Another one is when someone's coming new into an organization or into a role. So there are these moments that matter, where if we can smooth the way for people to navigate, then I think there's enough human intelligence in the system to do it well. And there's also enough, I'm a true believer in people want to do good work. People are generally good, other than, of course, some of the psychopaths and things like that. But generally, people are good. So if you take those two things, if we can make it simpler for people to navigate, then I think that goes a long way in terms of getting more conflict fluent.
I think, you brought up some great points today that make sense. That, the world is not fundamentally a dangerous place. There are some dangerous people and dangerous moments in it, right? And it is important to know when are those moments that matter. That's what you just said, that phrase right there, that kind of rang a bell for me. There's this really interesting podcast from a group called Beyond the Deal, BTD, that they labeled it Beyond the Moments That Matter. And it's about these, what they refer to as value inflection points, these moments, critical moments that matter. And they are often around conflict. And how you resolve it, how you address it, how you lean into it, how you perceive it, your perspective on it, and your expectations of it will set the stage for the outcomes. Which is, I think, one of your last steps in one of your models, right? Yeah. Which is about expecting the outcomes.
Yeah. So, and it plays, doesn't it, when you do those alliance coaching? It must 100%. Be playing big time.
All the time. One of my day jobs, that I do for fun, if you want to look at it that way, is working with companies that have joined with other companies, and they refer to those as alliances for those folks who aren't naturally business speak out there. And so I do work with, they come to table. You're bringing together two different companies who have their own inherent cultures within their company, their inherent systems and processes and the ways of doing things, and trying to create a relationship to promote a new product between the two of them. And sometimes those companies are in different countries. Sometimes they are small to big, a tiny 20-person team with a 4,000-person company. There's lots of different cultural differences. And I tell you what, a lot of it comes down to is the communication.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we have gone as deep as we can in one episode. And this one, like as I had said right at the start, was going to be a long one.
Thank you so much, Kavita, for all the explanations of the model. It was deep and interesting, and I can totally see the value for companies to really lean into this idea. And I don't know that it's just the HR folks out there. I think a lot of business leaders could understand these concepts a little bit better. And even my little nugget of the world, I recognize those names of those people. So I think they're relevant. So thank you for taking the time and diving deep with us.
What's coming next, Vicky?
We are going to be looking at, earlier I was talking about sort of alignment and communication sort of issues. So our next podcast, we're going to have the goal of really talking about how miscommunication doesn't always mean misalignment. We'll explore what happens when conflict hits a little bit too close to home and triggering maybe not just some of the culture issues like we talked about today, but also that inner critic that it resonates a little too deeply within you. And what can we do about it? So
Lovely.
Tune in for the next one and hear all about that. All right. We'll see you guys soon. Bye.